So when we look at the Upper Tier Tribunal's comments on the unallowable purpose issue, it starts by saying HMRC had two broad grounds of appeal. First, that the First Tier Tribunal's finding that LLC had a commercial purpose in entering into the loans was one which could not be reasonably entertained. The commercial purpose found by the FTT was therefore nothing more than a consequence of the tax purpose. And what HMRC was arguing was saying, listen, you know, if there was no tax advantage, then you never would have involved the UK in a US to US transaction. The only reason why you did it was to get the UK tax advantage, and because there was a UK tax advantage, you put all this money into this company to buy this other company, which all of a sudden gave you a commercial purpose. But you know, it is really the tax advantage that came first, and not the commercial purpose, because you could have done that in many other ways. And then it goes on to say, second, a just and reasonable apportionment needed to be carried out pursuant to Section 441. So what the First Tier Tribunal should have said is said, okay, so if we look at the principal purposes or the main purposes for this transaction, one was to save tax in the UK, the other one was to acquire the US operations of Barclays. We think that 60% or 40% of the purpose was to acquire, was to get the tax advantage, and the remaining percentages was to acquire the Barclays activities, and therefore for that percentage of the purpose that was a tax advantage, for that percentage the interest deduction should be disallowed. And the First Tier Tribunal said, oh, but there was no tax purpose here, it was all commercial purposes, and therefore I mean, there was a tax purpose, but it only came later, you know, and therefore 100% of the interest was deductible. And now the court, the Upper Tier Tribunal, says a just and reasonable apportionment needed to be carried out pursuant to the 441 in coming to conclusion that all debits ought to be apportioned to the commercial purpose. The FTT applied the wrong test. The only reason given by the FTT for its conclusion was Mr. Kushel's, this was a BlackRock employee in the UK, evidence had been that LLC5 would have entered into the loans even if there had been no tax advantage in doing so. The correct approach is to determine whether the reason that debits existed was in order to obtain a tax advantage, right? And things are twisted a bit here, because what Mr. Kushel said is, first of all, that they've been told you need to hand all the tax benefits to your sister companies because you can't use them themselves. But secondly, you know, by the time they got involved in a transaction, this transaction was planned by the BlackRock group tax department. It was so late that they basically couldn't stop anything. You know, a lot of documents have been prepared already, a lot of steps have been put into place. Acquiring this part of the Barclays operations through this entity was one tiny part, maybe not so tiny, of a much bigger picture of acquiring the global activities of this branch of Barclays activities. So it was too late to say, sorry, we're not going to do it. Yeah? And what Mr. Kushel also said is he knows his BlackRock people, and he knows that they do proper due diligence before they suggest something, and therefore he simply trusted that it was okay, and that there was a commercial purpose, and that was what the court relied on. And then the UK court comes with a number of interesting comments, very much UK centric, but I think still worth looking at. The first one, it says, is both parties have accepted that their respective challenges to the First Tribunal's findings as to the purpose of the loans are challenges to factual findings of the FTT. The FTT is a factual court, right? As such, they can only successfully challenge those findings if they satisfy the high threshold set out in Edwards versus Bairstow. And what that basically says is, you know, if it is reasonable that the first tier could have interpreted the facts like this, then the decision should stand. Just because it's also reasonable to interpret the facts in a different way by the Upper Tier Tribunal does not give the Upper Tier Tribunal the right to change the First Tier Tribunal decision, right? And then the court quotes another case. It says Farga UK versus Chobani UK Limited. it says, the higher courts have told the upper tier tribunal repeatedly. Appellate courts have been repeatedly warned by recent cases at the highest level not to interfere with findings of fact by trial judges of the first tier tribunal, unless compelled to do so. This applies not only to findings of primary fact, but also the evaluation of those facts and to inferences to be drawn from them, right? If it's reasonable that the first tier tribunal could interpret it this way, you need to leave it alone. It follows that the question before us, when exercising an error of law jurisdiction, because that's what the upper tier tribunal needs to do, it needs to find an error of law in these decisions, is not whether we would have made the same decision as the FTT. The test is whether the FTT's factual findings were within a reasonable range of conclusions that the properly directed tribunal could have made on the evidence available to it. And then it says, while the FTT's findings, this thing that this was a commercial purpose, could have been better expressed, which is a nice way of saying they were wrong, we do not consider that the Edwards versus Bairstow threshold has been crossed. The FTT was entitled to find that one of the main purposes of LLC 5 and the loans, as subjectively held by its board members, was a commercial purpose. It's not about whether the commercial purpose and was 100% worth of the argument and tax savings 0. This is just about whether the commercial purpose, whether there was a commercial purpose, right? And the court says, of course there was. And then the taxpayer made an argument saying, and tax was never a main purpose, right? But that is an argument looking at the whole structure that is so bogus that we will not discuss this here, and the court also just threw it out. I mean, it's a bit of a shame that the barrister of the taxpayer even bothered coming up with an argument like that. And now we get to, whether the division of the interest cost between the commercial purpose of the loan and the tax saving purpose of the loan, whether that was reasonable, right? And the upper tier tribunal say we consider that the FTT was wrong to apply a subjective approach when making the just and reasonable apportionment. The statutory test is to be applied without any gloss. TDS confirms, and it was a decision quoted by the court, that the question of whether there is tax avoidance main purpose is primarily to be decided by reference to the subjective intentions of the directors of a company. However, once such a purpose has been identified, so yes, they did want to save tax, the legislation simply requires that there be a just and reasonable apportionment. This test is to be applied objectively, right? So then you don't need to look at the intentions of the directors anymore. The FTT erred by applying a subjective test because they said, the board told us that they were told that the LLC 5 could not get any of the interest deductions, right? And that they would have signed even if there was no tax saving because it was too late to change anything. And then the UTT go on and says, if as appears to have been found by the FTT, a wholly subjective approach were to be applied at the apportionment stage, so not whether there was a tax saving motive, but how do you split it, it would enable a company to avoid the application of unallowable purposes rules by simply relying on the stated purpose of entering into the loans. And then you would have to believe what the director said instead of taking an objective step back and say, let's look realistically at this. How do we split the purposes between these two purposes of tax saving and acquisition. And then the court goes on to say, depending on the facts, it might also be helpful to check the just and reasonable apportionment conclusion by applying a but-for test. And I like this. Again, it may be UK specific, but it is something one can use in other countries' tax systems and TP systems as well. And they say, we agree with Mr. Ewart, which appeared for HMRC, that the creation and insertion of LLC 5 would not have been incurred but for the tax purpose, right? Because why would you in a US to US acquisition use a UK company if it's going to cost you $40 million more in transaction fees, right? Its commercial purpose was a byproduct of the consequence of the tax-driven decision. And as you can see from this, HMRC also won the second argument, even though it already won the first argument by saying this was not a TP transaction. This reasoning also applies to Mr. Prosecutor's alternative submission that at the time of the transaction, the tax benefit which was expected to arise was much smaller than it turned out to be as a result of the application of the post-world debt cap, this is new UK anti-abuse rules. However, this again depends on subjective beliefs of LLC and not the objective facts, because again, LLC believed that all of a sudden they couldn't get this deduction anymore, and then later they changed their minds and went into HMRC and say, you know what, we're taking the deduction in any case, and that's how they got to the 1 billion plus in interest deductions. We are satisfied that the FTT erred in law in deciding that it was just and reasonable to apportion all the debts arising from the loans to the commercial purpose. That was it for this week. I hope you enjoyed this case. It's been a long case, but there was also a lot of facts and details to cover. And it's been the first TP case in a while, and I look forward to seeing you soon again. Bye for now.